In your landmark book, Merchants of Doubt, published in 2010 and co-authored with Eric M. Conway, you trace the origins of what you describe as the modern era of fighting facts. You reveal how a small group of scientists closely tied to commercial and ideological interests has worked to obscure the truth on issues ranging from tobacco smoke and nuclear winter to acid rain, the ozone hole, and global warming. You underscore both the ruptures and continuities in this long history of denialism. So not only do we see recurring methods, but also the persistence of key conservative think tanks, and also the same political institutions as well as the same protagonists that reappear, all of whom share background in Cold War science in the Manhattan Project. To begin, what you call the tobacco strategy refers to a specific set of methods. Could you walk us through how this story unfolded, and who were its key protagonists, and how did they exploit both the problem of scientific uncertainty and the ambiguities surrounding statistical causation? More broadly, what distinguishes legitimate scientific doubt, rooted in its Cartesian foundations, from its ideological opposite?
The key strategy of the Merchants of Doubt is to exaggerate the amount of doubt or the amount of uncertainty in scientific work. So as you just suggested, of course, doubt is part of science, skepticism is part of what drives science, and I would say what we could call healthy skepticism, curiosity. These are the things that underpin all scientific work. But at the same time, even though you may still have some residual uncertainties about certain questions, it's also possible to know a lot about the world. And many times scientists reach a place where they would say, okay, well, yes, there might be some uncertainties, but we know the Earth's climate is changing and we know the cause is greenhouse gases. Or, sure, there's more than one cause of lung cancer, but we know that one of the major causes is cigarette smoking. What the Merchants of Doubt do is to blow the doubt out of proportion, or to blow the uncertainties out of proportion, to highlight the uncertainties, to put them front and center in order to suggest that the uncertainties are so great that the knowledge is really unsettled, and therefore it would be premature to take any sort of action. And that's really the key point of it. The point is not to have a debate about science. The point is to use a debate about science to block action. So whether it's controlling cigarettes, regulating the air pollution that causes acid rain, banning the chemicals that cause the ozone hole, or doing something today to transition to a green economy, in every case, the goal is the same. In every case, the goal is the same: to block action.
Frederick cites, along with hydrogen bomb creator Edward Teller and astrophysicist Robert Jastrow, became one of the first critics of the nuclear winter hypothesis, which was formulated by astronomer Carl Sagan and biologist Paul Ehrlich. When did this new phase of denial emerge? How was it reinforced by Reagan's official endorsement of strategic defense? And what role played the George C. Marshall Institute, which would later become the first public denier of human-made global warming?
The book Merchants of Doubt starts with a story about nuclear winter, and the reason it does is because we were trying to understand the origins of the story, and in particular, how a particular group of scientists started working together and in later years would become important climate change deniers. And so this group of scientists, Frederick Seitz, Bill Nirenberg, Bob Jastrow, later Fred Singer, initially come together in a debate over Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. So this initiative, known as SDI, also known as Star Wars, was an idea to put laser-based weapons in space and use those weapons to take out any potential incoming intercontinental ballistic missile. So on the face of it, it was something that seemed quite attractive to a lot of people, that you could defend the United States against a nuclear attack by taking out the weapons when they're on their way in. But it was actually extremely controversial, not just politically, but also among scientists themselves, because it was viewed as destabilizing. Because during the Cold War, most people felt that the Soviets and the United States had avoided a Third World War through something known as MAD, the doctrine of mutual assured destruction. The idea here was that both sides had giant stockpiles. These stockpiles were more than enough to destroy all life on Earth many times over, and therefore neither side would be stupid enough to launch a first strike, because they would know, let's say the United States launched a first strike, the Soviets would immediately launch their missiles. 18 minutes later, the whole world is wiped out. And so it would be MAD to do that. And so MAD had this double entendre of being both mutual assured destruction and crazy. And many scientists who worked in the nuclear weapons program, Hugh Gusterson wrote a very nice book about this a few years ago. You know, if you ask yourself the question, well, why would any scientist build weapons of mass destruction? Why would any decent human being want to build a hydrogen bomb? Well, part of the answer to the question during the Cold War was this doctrine of mutual assured destruction, that by building a large, reliable stockpile, it actually kept the peace. Now, you can agree or disagree with that rationalization, but I think it's fair to say that we know that many scientists accepted that argument. SDI was potentially destabilizing, because if the United States had a weapons-based, space-based weapons program, then it meant that actually this doctrine no longer applied. And so the United States might be tempted to launch a first strike against the Soviet Union on the theory that we didn't have to worry about the counterstrike because we'd just take out their missiles. And in fact, there were people in the Reagan administration who were arguing in favor of a preemptive first strike. So this wasn't just like a bunch of, lily-livered liberals. There were conservatives in the Reagan administration who were worried about this as well. And so because of this, a large movement developed among scientists to boycott SDI, to oppose the program and to refuse to accept funds to work on it. And this was led by Carl Sagan and the great physicist Hans Bethe, who had won the Nobel Prize for his work on nuclear fusion. So very prominent, very influential scientists said, no, this is a bad idea. We shouldn't do it. We shouldn't work on it. And 6,500 American scientists signed a pledge to boycott the program, not to participate, not to accept funding. This was historically unprecedented. There'd never been a case in the United States, or as far as I know, anywhere, where so many scientists had said, no, we won't work on this. It's just bad. We shouldn't do it. And the Reagan administration was extremely upset about it, and so were some of the allies of the administration. And one group of these allies were these men. And so Seyss Nirenberg and Jastrow actually created the George C. Marshall Institute initially as a place, a center from which they would defend SDI. And so it's really crucial for the story in a couple of ways. First of all, it tells us just how these people came together in the first place, which is of historic interest. But also it shows the roots of this story in the Cold War and this idea of containing communism. Because the arguments they would later make about the free market, about personal liberty, about the threats of government regulation were rooted in Cold War ideology, rooted in this idea that we were locked in a Manichaean conflict between good and evil, the Soviets on one side, the United States on the other, and with that, godless communism and God-fearing capitalism, and the idea that free market capitalism was a crucial part of American freedom. And so it wasn't just that we were fighting for freedom in some kind of generic way, but we were also fighting for capitalism as something that goes part and parcel with American freedom. So one of the things we show in the book is that this debate about SDI takes place mainly during the Reagan administration in the early 1980s. When the Cold War ends, circa 1989, you might have thought that these guys would be happy because, by all accounts, the West has won the Cold War. But instead, they find a new enemy to fight. And the new enemy is environmentalism, and particularly government regulation related to the environment, because they see that regulation as a kind of backdoor to communism, a slippery slope to socialism, and they fear that if the government begins to regulate the marketplace, that this will lead us to some form of Soviet-style centralized planning. And so they shift their attention then from this explicit fight against the Soviet Union to a kind of more subtle or more implicit fight in their own mind to other forms of socialism and communism, which they fear the United States will succumb to through the back door of government regulation. And that begins to happen almost immediately, almost as soon as the Cold War ends. So the very first report that they write challenging the scientific evidence of global warming is 1989. And it's also, there's a kind of historical coincidence or contingency here. I mean, it's just sort of luck. They're not related. But if we take 1989 as the year when the Cold War, more or less ends or starts to end, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, 1988 is the year that the IPCC is created. Now, those two things are not causally related, but they end up becoming historically related because the end of the Cold War leads these scientists to shift their attention to climate change.